Well, the lid is dry, and it turned out really good. I'm happy with it. Um, One thing I do want to note is that, and this is I really dislike using anything for this method other than 3/8 inch MDF. I can't extol the virtues of this product enough. It is just absolutely awesome. And the reason I'm saying that is that the half-inch plywood that I was forced to use because I didn't have enough of that, it warped it a little bit because of the moisture um, inherent in the pressing process when you essentially slather glue on each side like you're making a sandwich and slathering it with mayonnaise, and then press it in a press for an hour and 20 minutes, an hour and a half, kind of locking that moisture into it. It's bound to cause some distortion issues. And so I can tell by feeling it that the edges, it's cupped a little bit more than it was originally, basically. Not a big deal. I'll hopefully be able to work around it. But I never have that issue with MDF. MDF always comes out dead flat. Um, and the issue is, I mean, if we were using solid wood, I could simply level the box. Maybe joint the bottom is typically what I would do, just so that that's dead flat. The top really doesn't matter as much. But in this case, I can't because it's veneer, and you're dealing with forget what that is. It's very thin, not a lot of room. I certainly couldn't run that over a joiner. I certainly couldn't plane it with a hand plane. So you're basically just stuck with it being what it is. So I highly recommend, if you can source 3/8 inch MDF for this procedure, making these style of lids, it's definitely worth it. That said, I used half-inch plywood this time, and so that's what we're going to keep rocking and rolling with. So this is dried overnight. The glue is 100% cured, at least for this purpose. And the next step is going to be taking it to the router table and using a flush trim router bit to basically trim the edges of the veneer flush with the edge banding there. So that's what I'm going to do. I've got my router out. I've got the bit that I'm going to use out. Now for years I just used a regular straight cutting flush trim bit. I'm going to pull that out for visual effect. I typically use this one. This is a white side flush trim router bit, and I've had really good success with this. I actually have like 3 of these things, but I use one of these I use for only veneer, in hopes that I keep the cutters nice. And as you can see, most of the wear is right up there in the neighborhood where it would be from doing this sort of thing. I also advise cleaning your router bits, blades and shanks, whenever necessary, because if you got a little schmutz here and a little schmutz over here, it can not only affect the cut, but it can throw the balance of the router bit off after a while. So keep them clean. That said, I am foregoing that bit, and lately I've been using this. I got this from one of those Chinese overseas places, either AliExpress or Banggood, and it was really cheap. It was like $9. I figured, what the heck, I'm going to try it, and it works really well. The only issue is, I think I ordered the wrong one. Well, I know I ordered the wrong one for this application, because what this does, this is, in a router table, a down cut. In other words, when I spin this bit, as you can see, it's taking slices downward. Now it's a shearing cut, and so it's gentler on the fibers than the straight cutting bit, but it's pulling down, and because of that, anywhere where the grain is not supported, it's going to be pulling the veneer off of the lid. And what I should have done is gotten and again, I always have trouble with this. I believe I should have gotten an upcut spiral flush trim bit. And what that would do is it would cut the fibers upwards toward the lid, So worst case scenario, if you have any breakout on the fibers, it's basically always supported because the edge of the lid would be supporting the cutter at all times. In this case, it's going to be pulling the fibers down, and wherever that hole is, there's going to be a lack of support, and you basically you risk tearing fibers out. You risk them breaking away the wrong direction. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to use this. I think the other thing I just noticed is I don't have a lot of room to play with because I've got to get this. It's got two bearings and it's got that big thick stop on the top, and so I have to be able to get that in between the two layers of veneer. I have almost no room to do so, but I'm going to give it a shot. So here it goes. Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, this is a 1/4 inch shank bit. You can get, obviously, 1/2 inch shank solid carbide spiral flush trim bits, but I don't really see the need because carbide is expensive, and a 1/2 inch thick carbide bit is substantially more carbide and therefore going to be more expensive. I would guess maybe twice, maybe a little bit more expensive than twice as expensive as the 1/4 inch, and it's going to serve the same purpose. So I went with the 1/4 inch shank, but 1/2 inch shank is available. When you're using this, especially because this is a down cut router bit, you want to use the smallest opening plate that you have available to you, because that is going to be acting as your support for the fibers of this veneer. And so what I'm doing here is just making sure that I have clearance, that this top stop is not going to end up bumping into the top piece of veneer. We wouldn't want that. So I'm going to play with it until I get it so that it just clears the top piece of veneer, but also that I have enough blade exposed to take care of the bottom veneer, which is the one we're trying to cut away. And I think I have that now, so I'm going to go ahead and put my hearing protection on, put my eye protection on, and we're going to go ahead and flush trim 1/2. Okay, well, that is 1/2, and it looks really good. What that tells me, a common problem, and I had kind of tried to warn you guys, caution you guys earlier on about this. When you're spreading your glue, you really want to pay close attention to the edges because, again, I think it has something to do with the surface tension in liquid, but anytime you put glue on a flat surface, as it dries, as it sits there, it tends to pull away from the edges. And what can happen if you don't have enough glue on the edges, or no glue at all, when you're doing this operation, is it will pull a chunk of veneer off, and you'll be left with a very odd-shaped hole right down to your plywood. So you don't want that. This tells me that I did a good job of that. I don't see any fibers out of place. It's just absolutely perfectly flush trimmed to the lid blank. So that was the hard part. Now I can kind of raise the router bit up as much as I want to, as long as the bearing is still in contact with the middle of the plywood itself. So, and now you guys will probably be able to get a better idea of what's happening here. And another thing, I'm sure you guys know this. If you don't, when you're going with the grain, because of how grain runs on wood, especially in very fragile veneer, I like to do a climb cut the whole way. You're not dealing with enough wood or mass that a climb cut is dangerous. In other words, you're not going to get any kickback from the fragile little tiny piece of veneer here to affect, throwing this piece in any direction or not. That said, a climb cut is much gentler on the piece of wood because you're taking smaller bites. If I were to take it the way you generally do take routing, I would risk it peeling off a big piece of veneer and having it run with the grain. And if the grain runs from the edge inward, I risk breaking veneer off where we don't want it to be broken off. As you can see right here, it's a pretty good illustration. Right here I've got a little bit of a break, and so if I'm routing this direction, that router bit strikes this, it can kind of rip that, and it will run wherever it wants to run. So by doing a climb cut, you eliminate that, or at least you reduce the chances that you're going to have a boo-boo. So that said, here goes the bottom. Let me show you guys what I mean here. See that? That is what you don't want. I got lucky. Okay. Well, I could not have illustrated that any better. You saw when I tried to route the standard direction, it took this huge chunk and just ripped it off. And that is why I always climb cut against the long grain of the veneer when you're going with the grain. The end grain, it really doesn't matter because the grain's coming off perpendicular. No matter which direction you go, you're cutting. You're not cutting. It's not going to run. It's not going to rip along the grain. So it doesn't matter if you climb cut. And in that case, I err on the side of caution and route the proper direction. But again, you saw when I was doing the climb cut, which is routing, basically routing backwards, routing with the spin of the bit. Yes, it broke off chunks here and there, but the chunks were much, much smaller. And so again, you reduce the risk of splitting your veneer past the point with which you intended to. So now we have our lid. It is flush trimmed. It looks really good. The next step that I'm going to do is basically round the edges over, and this is certainly not the final dimension. I'm only doing that for safety, because when you have this rough, scraggly edge, it's easy for that to get caught on something and rip. By easing these edges over and rounding them over, you create a kind of a safety net for yourself where it's not going to snag on anything. It doesn't matter how doesn't matter how crazy you go, because again, this is not the final dimension. What we're going to do, the process from here on out is going to be jointing one face. And it looks like, luckily I did this right. I have a jointed surface back here, so this is flat. I will simply run a hand plane along there to pretty that up, make it nice and smooth and basically finished. Then we're going to lay it up to the box. We're going to mark our hinges and actually install the hinges without mortising them. And we're going to do that in such a way that we have overhang on all the other three sides. And in some instances, like I can tell I'm going to have to do that here, I'm going to have to take a little bit of stock off the back to make sure that I don't have too much overhang on the front. If you remember, we gave ourselves about 1/4 of an inch of wiggle room. So as long as I have overhang on the right side, left side, and the front, and that overhang is less than 1/4 of an inch, then I will be able to take this whole thing, once the hinges are on it, flip it over, and run it on the flush trim bit, and it will cut the lid to the exact size that the box is. So I'm going to go ahead and ease these corners a little bit, figure out what kind of hinges I want to use, and we'll pick back up then. Okay, so I have the edges sanded, and I noticed something. If you guys are working with redwood like I am, it is so soft that I actually just used 220, and that was enough, just with a few strokes of 220, to round these edges over sufficiently. 120, that's so soft it might even be too much. So I was very careful on the end grain to route with the grain, to sand with the grain this direction. You don't want to, especially right after flush trimming, come in and sand across the end grain perpendicular to it, because you risk tearing the pieces of the grain out. So at any rate, now as I said, I've got to get a nice finished end to mount on the back where the hinges go. So I also need to take some of the stock off to make sure that I don't have more than 1/4 of an inch overhang on all the other remaining three sides. So to do that, I am using my number 4 smoothing plane and this cool little fence. You guys don't have to use this. I use this. It's from Veritas. It just allows me to be certain that I am planing 90 degrees, because again, this is going to be almost certainly be a finished edge. Another thing too, you have to be careful. So in looking at which edge you want to be the front and the back, keep in mind that the front edge you're going to be routing off a pretty substantial amount, probably about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch. So on this side, I have this little area where the edge trim, I guess, got torn out maybe when I was planing it, and so there's a little boo-boo there. So I'm going to put that on the front, because I'm almost certain that when I route, I'm going to route right through that, and that's just going to disappear. The back side, however, I'm just going to be taking a few swipes with a plane to knock it down, maybe 1/16 of an inch or more. And so I don't want any damage on the back side that I can't remove with the plane. When I am done planing this side, this is going to be the finished surface. So this is going to be the surface that we use to reference and place the hinges. So choose your sides carefully, and as usual, make sure you're planing with the grain where possible. bit of wax. This thing's shifting a little bit on me here. And that's what you're going for. You're going for nice continuous shavings. That's when you know you've got it nice and flat and level. And then at the very least, I'm going to continue planing until all the flaws disappear. So the flaws are gone. That is a beautiful, flawless surface right off the plane blade. So the next thing is going to be to continually, kind of, as the British would say, offering it up to your box to make sure, again, that you are not going to be left with an overhang greater than 1/4 of an inch. And again, why that's important is we're going to be flipping this over and using the box as a template to route the lid. If you end up routing more than 1/4 of an inch off of any of these sides, you will end up routing right through the solid redwood edge banding. So right there, I am still about 3/16 proud of 1/4 of an inch. So I've got a little bit of work to do. And again, that's why we used a fat 1/4 of an inch. So if you can take it down to 1/4 of an inch or just below 1/4 of an inch, you're typically going to be safe. Now, another thing I'm noticing, and again, I typically do not miter the edge banding here, but because we did that, we're going to risk exposing some of the end grain in the miters if we're not careful to remove an equal amount of stock from all 4 sides. So I'm going to try to do that. In theory, that should work. If I take off, say, 3/16 off of this side, or about 3/16 off of this side, then hopefully I'll end up taking 3/16 off the rest of the 3 sides with the router table, and the miters will look, perfectly closed up. But we'll have to see. So I'm getting a little bit of tear out on this edge of the miter, if you can see that. So what I'm going to do, I'll take my chisel, and just create a slight chamfer on the back edge, because again, this is going to be routed off, number one. Number two, the box has a slight chamfer, so we're going to end up chamfering these maybe a little bit too to match. What that will do is it will prevent me from hitting this the wrong way with the plane blade and tearing out a big chunk. bust out the overhang at this point. And what I'm doing here is I am bringing the rear of the box lid that I just planed completely flush with the back of the box. Okay, and I'm going to hold it in place while I use my double square to measure the overhang. I am getting really close, so that is, we got about a 1/16 of an inch to go. Now typically I would use a jointer to do this, but again, I mitered it, and so every step of the way here I'm realizing why I typically don't miter the edge banding, because it just creates more of a headache in other parts of this project. And again, because of how this goes together, I'm not even sure the miters are going to line up nicely at the end. And to reiterate, it really doesn't matter. The appeal of this lid is that it's going to look like a solid piece, unless you really inspect it, unless you really are familiar with wood and woodworking. And even still, it's still a beautiful lid. It's impressive, man. It's a 1/2 inch thick plate platen that is going to stay dead flat no matter the season. At least I hope, since this is the 1/2 inch plywood, not the 3/8 inch MDF. So typically, if this were the way I typically do it, the long sides would be continuous, and I would have just done butt jointed smaller pieces in here. I could literally just take this to a router table, or I'm sorry, to a joiner, and make a few passes over the joiner, testing it every time, and it would be a lot quicker than this, where I'm having to go back and forth with the plane and take off small shavings at a time. But it's what I chose to do, so we're going to roll with it. If I were to take this to the joiner, I would risk one of those, the teeth of the joiner, catching this and just totally ripping out a big chunk, catching on the wrong piece of that miter there. So we don't want that. Okay, so we have gotten down already to the edge of our chamfer. I'm just going to introduce another small chamfer. And all I'm doing is taking my chisel and making an upward shearing cut in the direction of the grain, so that if anything does break out, it breaks out past the point where it would be an issue. Okay. And that is right at 1/4 of an inch. So I could probably get away with routing from there, but I'm going to do a little bit more. What I really want to do is be under 1/4 of an inch, so that I'm sure I'm going to be left with at least a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch of solid redwood on that front edge. The other edges are nice. The other edges are perfect. I'm looking at, if I equally space these overhangs in the sides, I'm looking at like a fat 1/8 of an inch. So those are fine. It's just this front and back that needs a little tweaking. And so I'm running into a little bit of an issue on the beginning of the cut. I'm hitting the end grain from the front piece of that miter, so I'm going to go ahead and did a small chamfer on the front of that cut as well. There we go. Willing to bet that was painfully slow, but I think we've got it. And the other thing too is oftentimes when you're doing this and you fit the hinges, the back of the lid can end up overhanging by a 32nd or so. So that's going to buy you a little more room as well. And that is perfect. That is about a 32nd of an inch under a quarter. So we're good. That's it. Yeah, that was a little time consuming. Again, if I hadn't mitered the lid, it would not have needed to be as time consuming. So I probably won't do that again. But look at that. You can see that it's just absolutely seamless. And it doesn't look like much now because it's not sanded. This front edge is still rough. But that'll give you a pretty good idea of what you're going to be looking at. And as soon as oil hits this thing, man, it's just going to come alive. So I'm going to turn the camera off. I'm going to go find some hinges that I think would look good, and we'll turn you back on here when I put the hinges on. See you then. Okay, so off camera, I went ahead and put the hinges on. So all I did here, I ended up using these gatehouse hinges, and these are 3/4 by 5/8 hinges. You get 4 to a pack. They're by Gatehouse, or I think National makes the same exact thing. And I get them at Lowe's or Home Depot, one of those two places. They're inexpensive. It's like $3 for 4, which is, you know, what, $1.50 a box. I chose to use the brass in this instance because I feel that it's going to look better with the colors. And it's going to allow me to use maybe a brass closure on the front, and then that'll match. So all I did, I offered up the hinge to the box. First of all, I had to pick my side. And what was a little disappointing to me is that the most beautiful side, in my opinion, is this side here with that beautiful Rayfleck pattern that continues over onto this piece. But because this tail is shorter than that top tail, you see the inlay ends up looking crooked. And again, to remind you guys, if you hadn't seen the beginning of this project, the stock already had the inlay in it. This is scrap from my scrap pile. This is not something that I typically do. I do not add inlay prior to dovetailing a box or prior to putting it together. Because you end up with this kind of funky looking situation here. But it is what it is. This is scrap wood. It was a scrap wood project. So that's what we were left with. The only issue is the back side where the inlay looks a little better. Still not great because you've got a skinny piece visible there over the tail, and you've got a thick piece visible here over the tail. It's just not as busy, and you got that big dark spot there. I think that is grain filler that I did not sand completely, and then it got the moisture in it, and I'd mentioned this before, but the tannins in wood, especially white oak, can interact with moisture and metals and whatever else is used to make that stuff. And so I'm probably going to be able to sand that out. Even still, just not as exciting of a side. So I chose that side as my back. And then we're going to assume this is the back for now, just to walk you through my process. And to be perfectly honest, I shot a whole video of myself doing these hinges, putting these hinges on, but I was shirtless. And, you know, I certainly don't know how YouTube would feel about that, but I would hate to cause you guys any emotional damage from seeing me shirtless. So I'm just going to do this little recap here post fact. So I take the hinge, I squeeze it. That's the maximum opening available to me. So it's locked in that position, and I slide it against the back, so it can't move any further down and it can't move any further forward. At that point, I use my double square to find a good position that looked good. In this case, 1 inch from either side looked good. So I use the double square to mark 1 inch in from each side. And at that point, I held it very firmly in place, and I used a mechanical pencil right there to draw a circle where the screw hole would go right there. I then held it with one finger very carefully without letting it shift. I can't do that. I can't do it with the camera in my hand, but take my word for it.